Hi, my name is Leah Thomas, and I am an environmental justice educator and content creator. I founded a nonprofit called Intersectional Environmentalist and recently released a book all about intersectional environmentalism called The Intersectional Environmentalist. So I'm a really big fan of that. So if you want to check out my book to learn more, I would recommend supporting your local indie bookstore or going to bookshop.org.
Hey Leah, it's so good to have you here at the Hollywood Climate Summit this year. And of course, to hear your wise words on intersectional environmentalism, as well as many other things. So I want to turn questions to you. My first would be, what is your personal definition of intersectionality?
Yes, so I love to start with a quote by Audre Lorde, which is, "There is no such thing as a single issue because we don't live single issue lives. We're very dynamic human beings, and so are our identities." So intersectional theory was created by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 because she started to see some kind of loopholes in the legal system where there's a court case by GM. I know this is a long explanation, but I'm going to get to it, I swear. So there was a court case at GM where unfortunately all of the Black women were fired, and they tried to take it to a judge, take it to a court for a discrimination lawsuit. But unfortunately, their case was dismissed under the grounds that while there were still Black men who worked at GM and there were still white women who worked at GM, so the judge concluded that it couldn't have been racial discrimination or gender-based discrimination. So there was a loophole because it was a combination of those two things, racial and gender-based discrimination. So that's where we get intersectional theory to make sure that we look at compounding factors of identity aspects to make sure that we have the most comprehensive solution. So that's the origins of intersectional theory. It kind of started with race and gender, but now we can also consider things like spirituality, ability, race, so on and so on.
It's really nice to hear the history element there. I feel like we're always forgetting the social justice movements that created the groundwork for all the things that we're doing. Would love to hear the story of how you got into the climate movement and how you started to see the intersections of climate justice and racial justice.
So I got into the climate movement kind of accidentally, I would say. I've always been really passionate about science, I guess. I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian because, in particular, I just really like animals. But over time, when I was studying biology at first, and then I switched my major to environmental science and policy again, just because I really liked ecosystems ecology, I didn't know I was going to be a climate advocate years later. At that same time, that's when the Black Lives Matter movement started in the United States. And it hit really close to home because I grew up about 10 minutes away from Ferguson, Missouri. So while the aftermath of the police officer involved shooting of Michael Brown and the uprisings that followed for months that impacted my hometown, I flew to California and I began my studies as an environmental science and policy student. And I just felt so far removed from my community and kind of a sense of survivor's remorse. And I kept thinking, okay, there has to be a way to help. There has to be a way to help. And social justice is so big. So maybe I can tackle one piece of social injustice that is special to the work that I'm doing. So I started to look at environmentalism as I was learning about environmental science. And I started to see that the same communities like Ferguson or lower income and Black and Brown communities that face social injustice were also struggling with things like air quality and water quality and lack of tree coverage, et cetera. So that's how I really got into climate activism and environmental justice in particular, and looking at issues in a really intersectional way, because I just kept seeing, oh my gosh, the same communities that are being impacted by social injustice are also being impacted by environmental injustice. And this can't be a coincidence.
I want to talk about critical race theory. Some folks might not know what it even is or aren't aware that it's connected to climate. What's your perspective on this?
I love this question so much. Okay, so what exactly is critical race theory? It is not diversity and inclusion education, which is what it's been positioned as. I would say critical race theory is intersectionality or intersectional theory adjacent. And that's because the creator of intersectional theory, Kimberly Crenshaw, is also a pioneer of critical race theory. So both of these theories are things that kind of came about in advanced education. They're theories, so they're not things that are being taught to like young students and things like that. But anywho, so I just want to say that because something that often happens with theories that are created by Black women and people of color is that they're distorted in some ways. And that's because of racism, I would say, and some other things. But what is critical race theory? So essentially, it argues that if you're in a society and there's a dominant group that is reflected in positions of power unequally. So, for example, government offices, colleges, academic institutions, the criminal justice system, etc. That unequal power and representation can lead to systemic injustice and discrimination and power struggles. So, critical race theory really is asking the question, who is in power? And how is that leading to certain outcomes or legal outcomes and things like that? So in the United States, for example, if you look at the power structures in the United States, there's a really great study that came out from the New York Times, I believe in 2018, called Faces of Power. I talk about it in my book, and they're looking at the legal system. They're looking at, local, state, and federal governments, school systems, etc. And they see that particularly white men are unequally reflected in positions of power. So what does that mean? You start to see legal outcomes that start to favor white men or white citizens, etc., and harsher sentencing for people who don't fall into that group where people are in power. So critical race theory essentially just asks that question, who is in power? Is it equal? Is it unequal? And what are outcomes based on who's in power?
Ultimately, this workshop is about dispelling tropes and inspiring creators and producers to dig deeper in their climate storytelling. We were chatting earlier about Mary Anais Heglar's quote, climate change is the first existential threat to people of color. You know it well. So I would love to just hear from you about your advice in terms of dispelling tropes and, how can we do better as creators and filmmakers? Yeah, that's my question.
So, the climate crisis is not the first existential threat for people of color or Black folks. And I think that's really important to consider in climate storytelling. Even issues like eco anxiety might face or might impact different communities differently because they might already be kind of existing with elevated levels of anxiety because of social injustice in their communities and so many other things. And I think this is also really important when we're looking at the world as a whole and the global north and the global south. Even when we're talking about things like ecofeminism, there's this really great quote in my book from an ecofeminist advocate that's saying that ecofeminism can be sustenance-based ecofeminism, where people, in the global north might be talking about things like liberation and those sorts of things, when other people in the global south might also be talking about access to food and water and other just like sustenance and survival, etc. So I think it's really important to look at those layers and all those sorts of things because people might experience things like eco anxiety or the climate crisis differently. And oftentimes, when I, as a Black woman, am watching climate films, and there's kind of a sense of urgency where main characters might say things, or white main characters might be like, why isn't anyone paying attention to the climate crisis? And they're so upset. And I wish I could compassionately guide them and say, because there are Black folks in this country who are just trying to live and survive every day. So it's not that they don't care about the climate crisis, but they also care about where they're going to get their next meal. They also care about the air pollution in their neighborhoods that they didn't even cause. So it's really important, especially not to shame people who are unfortunately struggling with social injustices as well. The climate crisis is not the first or only existential threat to communities of color.